The person who left you did not leave you. They left a version of you that no longer exists. And that distinction is going to change everything you think you understand about avoidant attachment, about self-transformation, and about why the very people who pulled away from you are suddenly circling back the moment you stop needing them to. There is something deeply unsettling happening in the psychology of human attraction that nobody is talking about honestly. When you transform yourself, genuinely, structurally, at the level of your nervous system and your identity, you do not just become more attractive, you become unrecognizable, and unrecognizable is threatening to people who thought they had you figured out, threatening to people who made a calculated, unconscious decision that you were safe to leave because you would always be there, orbiting them, predictable as gravity. What you are about to hear is not a strategy to win someone back. This is something far more dangerous than that. This is the psychology of what happens when a man or a woman decides, at the deepest possible level, that they are done being someone who can be left behind, and why that decision, made fully and without apology, rewrites the entire social dynamic around you. Stay with this, because most people will not be ready for what comes next. People who study attachment theory and the sterile comfort of academic papers will tell you that avoidants simply need space, that they are wired differently, that their withdrawal is not personal, and on a clinical level that is true. But what those papers do not tell you, what nobody sitting in a therapist's office drawing attachment diagrams will say out loud, is that avoidants are exquisitely, almost supernaturally sensitive to one specific psychological signal. Not neediness, not attractiveness, not even confidence in the conventional sense. They are sensitive to your level of self-possession, to whether or not you have fully, completely, and without reservation claimed ownership of your own life. The moment that signal changes, the moment you stop being someone who is available to be abandoned, something ancient and primal activates inside the avoidant nervous system, and they turn around. You need to understand what an avoidant is actually doing when they pull away from you. This is not cruelty, though it can feel like cruelty. This is not indifference, though it wears the costume of indifference perfectly. What an avoidant person is doing at the neurological level is running a survival calculation. They are asking, without conscious awareness, without deliberate thought, a question that their nervous system learned to ask in childhood. Is this person going to consume me? Is closeness with this person going to cost me myself? And when they sensed that you needed them, when they detected that your emotional stability was partly contingent on their presence, they answered that question with a quiet, devastating yes. And they moved away from you the way a person moves away from something that might swallow them whole. That sounds harsh. It is harsh. But here is what makes it genuinely important rather than just painful to hear. The avoidant did not move away from you because you were unworthy. They moved away from you because you were available in a way that frightened them. Your openness, your warmth, your willingness to be emotionally present, these are not flaws, these are extraordinary qualities. But when they are offered to someone whose nervous system associates intimacy with engulfment, those qualities register not as gifts, but as weight, as pressure, as the early warning signs of something they have spent their entire life learning to escape. So you were not rejected. You were misread by someone whose instrument for reading people was calibrated in a house where love came with conditions, where closeness preceded loss, where needing someone meant eventually being let down by them. You were not the problem. You were simply the clearest available mirror of their deepest unresolved wound. And mirrors for people who do not want to see themselves clearly are the most threatening objects in the world. Now here is where the transformation begins, and this is the part that will make you deeply uncomfortable if you are still carrying the story that getting them back is the goal. The version of you that was left, that version had one critical structural vulnerability. That version of you had placed the avoidant, consciously or unconsciously, at the center of your psychological world. Not because you were weak, not because you were foolish, but because human beings are wired for pair bonding, and when you bond with someone, your nervous system begins to organize itself around their presence. This is not dysfunction. This is biology. This is the ancient machinery of human attachment doing exactly what it was designed to do. But here is what that biological fact created in your dynamic with an avoidant. The more your nervous system organized around them, the more available you became. The more available you became, the more their nervous system registered threat. The more threat they registered, the further they pulled. The further they pulled, the more anxiously you reached. And in that cycle, that grinding, exhausting, soul-eroding cycle, you became someone you were never supposed to be. You became someone whose emotional temperature was entirely determined by another person's behavior. Someone who checked their phone with a particular kind of desperation. Someone who replayed conversations, searching for the moment things shifted, trying to locate the precise word or the precise silence that changed everything. That person, the one caught in that cycle, that is the version that was left. And here is the truth you must sit with long enough for it to actually land. That version deserved to be left. Not because you were bad, not because you were unlovable, but because that version of you was not fully inhabiting your own life. You had vacated yourself, moved out of the center of your own existence, and handed over the deed to someone who was constitutionally incapable of maintaining what you gave them. Transformation does not begin with changing your behavior toward the avoidant. It does not begin with going no contact as a tactic or engineering your Instagram to look like you are thriving or reading the right books about attachment so you can say the right things at the right moments. All of that is performance. And avoidants, who are often extraordinarily perceptive because hypervigilance is a survival skill they developed young, can detect performance at a distance. They spent their childhood learning to read the emotional weather of their caregivers, to detect the subtle difference between genuine calm and performed calm. You cannot fool them with a strategy. You can only transform them with reality. Real transformation begins with a single seismic internal shift. It begins the moment you stop making the avoidance return the metric by which you measure your own recovery. This sounds simple. It is not simple at all, because your nervous system has been running on the question of them, on the low-frequency hum of will they come back, did I matter, what does their silence mean? And that question has become so ambient, so woven into the background of your daily consciousness that you have stopped noticing it is there. It is like the sound of a fan in a room you have been sitting in for hours. You stopped hearing it, but it is still running, and it is still consuming energy you need for something else. The moment you genuinely redirect that energy, not as a strategy, not as a technique, but because you have made a real and irreversible decision about who you are and what your life is for, the entire energetic signature you broadcast into the world changes. This is not mystical. This is physics and psychology operating simultaneously. When you are no longer organized around someone else's return, you move differently. You speak differently. You make eye contact differently. You fill space differently. The particular quality of desperation, which has a smell, a texture, an almost audible frequency, simply disappears from you, and in its place appears something that is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily magnetic. Self-possession, the quality of a person who is fully at home inside their own life. Think about the people in your life, or in history, or in the books you have read, who carried that quality. The ones who walked into a room and did not immediately begin scanning for approval. The ones who spoke without the slight upward inflection of someone who is asking you to validate their right to have an opinion. The ones who could sit in silence without filling it anxiously, who could be disagreed with without visibly recalibrating, who could be desired without becoming intoxicated by the desire, and who could be left without unraveling. Those people are not cold, they are not detached, they are not emotionally unavailable. They are, in fact, often the warmest people in any room, but their warmth does not come from need. It comes from overflow. It comes from a place of genuine fullness, from a life so richly inhabited that connection with others is an addition, never the foundation. That is what you are building, not a tactic, not a mask. A life so genuinely inhabited that you become someone the avoidance nervous system cannot categorize using its old framework, because the old framework, the one that filed you under safe to leave, available to return to, will orbit indefinitely, was built on a version of you that no longer exists. And when the avoidant looks for that version, they will not find it. And that absence, that clean, undeniable, non-manipulative absence of the person they thought they knew, will do something to them that nothing you could have said or done in the midst of your pain could ever have accomplished. It will make them uncertain, for the first time, in a dynamic where they believed they held all the psychological cards. They will not know where they stand. And for an avoidant, for someone who has structured their entire relational strategy around maintaining control over their level of closeness and distance, uncertainty about where they stand with you is the most powerful force in the known universe. And that uncertainty does not arrive as a thought. It does not arrive as a conscious realization where they sit down and logically conclude that you have changed. It arrives as a feeling, a subtle, disorienting, deeply unsettling feeling that something in their world has shifted without their permission. Avoidants are extraordinarily skilled at managing distance. They have spent decades perfecting the architecture of their emotional space, knowing exactly how far to let someone in, exactly when to begin withdrawing, exactly how much silence is required to reestablish the sense of control that intimacy threatens. But that entire system, that elaborate, unconsciously constructed system, is calibrated for a specific version of you. The version that waited, the version that reached, the version whose emotional gravity pulled in their direction even when they were moving away. When that version disappears, their system has nothing to push against, and a system that has nothing to push against does not find peace. It finds disorientation. Because the avoidance withdrawal was never really about not wanting you. That is the misconception that causes so much unnecessary suffering. The withdrawal was about managing the terror of wanting you too much. The distance was not indifference. It was the only tool they had for surviving the intensity of what they felt in your presence. And now that you are no longer pressing against their walls, now that you are no longer providing the emotional pressure that made those walls feel necessary, something deeply counterintuitive begins to happen. The walls start to feel less like protection and more like isolation. This is the psychological mechanism that nobody explains clearly enough. Avoidants do not chase because you became more attractive in a superficial sense. They do not suddenly reconsider because you posted something compelling on social media or because mutual friends mentioned you are doing well. Those things might trigger a surface-level curiosity, but they do not produce the deep, almost involuntary pull that brings an avoidant back with genuine intention rather than mere nostalgia. What produces that pull is something far more fundamental. It is the removal of the threat. When you are fully inhabiting your own life, when you are no longer energetically available to be the thing they manage their distance from, you stop being a source of potential engulfment and start being something they have never quite encountered in you before. You become a mystery, and the avoidant mind, which is endlessly preoccupied with questions of closeness and distance, cannot resist a mystery it thought it had already solved. Understand something critical about the way avoidant attachment formed in the first place. The child who became the avoidant adult learned very early that expressing need led to disappointment. That reaching toward a caregiver, with all the vulnerability and hope that reaching requires, produced one of two outcomes. Either the caregiver was overwhelmed and withdrew, or the caregiver responded inconsistently in a way that made the reaching itself feel dangerous. So the child made an adaptation, a brilliant survival-oriented adaptation that came at an enormous cost. They learned to need less. Or more precisely, they learned to perform needing less, to build a self-concept organized around independence, around self-sufficiency, around the story that they were fine on their own, and that closeness was something other, needier people required. That adaptation kept them safe as a child. As an adult, it became a prison, because the need did not disappear. The longing for genuine connection did not disappear. The desire to be truly known by another person, which is one of the most fundamental human desires in existence, did not disappear. It went underground. It became a subterranean river running beneath all the composure and the self-sufficiency and the practiced emotional distance. And that river is still running in the avoidant who left you. It has never stopped running. The question is whether the version of you that exists now, the transformed, self-possessed, fully inhabited version, is someone that river can finally, safely flow toward. Here is what the transformation actually requires. And this is the part where most people lose their nerve, because what it requires is not discipline in the conventional sense. It is not waking up earlier or going to the gym more consistently or reading the right books, though all of those things have their place. What the transformation fundamentally requires is a willingness to grieve the version of yourself that organized around the avoidant, to actually mourn that person with the full weight and honesty that mourning demands, and then to make a deliberate, eyes-open decision to build something in their place that is entirely, unconditionally yours. Grief is not weakness. Grief is the process by which the psyche digests loss and converts it into wisdom. The people who skip grief, who bypass it with busyness or bitterness or the premature adoption of a new identity, carry the unprocessed loss inside them like an unhealed wound, and it shows up in every subsequent relationship as either neediness or numbness. Neither of those serves you. Neither of those is what you are after. What you are after is integration, the capacity to look at what happened, to see it clearly, without the distortion of self-blame or of making the avoidant into a villain, and to extract from it a deeper understanding of yourself and of what you genuinely need and deserve in a relationship. Because here is a truth that cuts in an uncomfortable direction. Part of what drew you to the avoidant was something in you that found their distance familiar. Something in you that associated love with a degree of uncertainty, with having to earn presence, with the particular intensity that comes from never quite feeling secure. That familiarity is worth examining, not with self-judgment. Self-judgment is just another way of avoiding genuine self-knowledge, but with the kind of honest, compassionate curiosity that a good therapist or a genuinely wise friend might bring to your history. Where did you first learn that love required pursuit? Where did you first learn that your emotional needs were too much? Where did you first develop the capacity to make yourself smaller in the presence of someone whose approval you needed? Those questions are not diversions from the work of transformation. They are the work of transformation, because you cannot build a genuinely new version of yourself on top of unexamined foundations. You will simply repeat the same pattern with different people, and each repetition will cost you more time, more energy, more of the particular quality of hope that makes human beings willing to be vulnerable with one another. The new version of you that makes the avoidant turnaround is not constructed through strategy. It is excavated. It is uncovered by the patient, sometimes painful, always ultimately liberating process of removing everything that was never authentically yours, all the people-pleasing, all the self-abandonment, all the unconscious bargaining that said, I will make myself smaller so that you will stay, and discovering what remains when all of that is gone. What remains is something extraordinarily solid, something that does not shift in response to another person's mood, something that does not recalibrate itself based on whether or not it is being chosen. That solidity, that deep, unperformable, unshakable quality of knowing who you are and what you are worth, is what the avoidance nervous system registers as entirely new, as something it does not have a protocol for managing. And without a protocol, the avoidant cannot maintain their distance, not because you have manipulated them, not because you have played a game skillfully, but because the thing they were protecting themselves from, the thing that made closeness feel like a threat, was always, at its core, the fear of being consumed by someone who needed them more than they needed themselves. When that person no longer exists, when you are genuinely, structurally, at the level of your nervous system and your identity, someone who does not need them in order to be whole, the entire premise of their withdrawal collapses. There is nothing left to withdraw from, and in that collapse, something opens in them that their defense system had kept sealed for a very long time. Whether or not the avoidant returns is ultimately not the point. That statement will frustrate you if you are still in the early stages of this process, and that frustration is understandable and legitimate. But stay with it anyway because it contains something genuinely important. The version of you that emerges from real transformation, from the actual excavation and reconstruction of your identity, will not experience the avoidance potential return the way the previous version of you would have experienced it. The previous version would have felt relief, validation, the sudden restoration of worth. The new version will feel something quieter and more powerful: discernment. The capacity to look at the person who is returning and ask, with genuine clarity and without desperation distorting the answer, is this person, as they actually are right now, someone I want to build something with? That question, asked from a place of real strength rather than from the anxious hope of someone who needs the answer to be yes, is the question that changes everything, because it means you are no longer a passive participant in your own relational life, waiting to be chosen or unchosen by someone else's emotional availability. You are an active agent, someone with standards that are not negotiable, someone whose time and energy and emotional presence are genuinely valuable, and who knows it, not as a mantra, not as something you tell yourself to feel better, but as a lived, embodied, unshakable fact. The moment you become that person, the moment self-worth shifts from concept to lived reality, something else begins to happen that is equally important and far less discussed. The people around you start to reorganize, not just the avoidant, everyone, because human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to changes in the social hierarchy of worth, and when someone who was previously operating from a deficit of self-value suddenly begins operating from genuine abundance, it disrupts the unconscious social calculations that everyone in that person's orbit has been making. Friends who subtly depended on your insecurity to feel more secure themselves will become uncomfortable. Acquaintances who enjoyed the particular social currency of being more put together than you will begin to recalibrate, and the avoidant, who built their entire relational strategy on the premise that you needed them more than they needed you, will feel the ground shift beneath them in a way they cannot immediately name or explain. This reorganization is not something you engineer. It is something you allow. There is a profound difference between those two things, and that difference is everything. Engineering implies manipulation, implies that you are performing transformation rather than embodying it. And as already established, the avoidant is too perceptive, too attuned to the subtle frequencies of emotional authenticity to be fooled by performance for long. What you are doing is not engineering a social outcome. You are simply becoming more fully yourself and allowing the social consequences of that to unfold without interference. That requires a particular kind of courage that is rarely celebrated but is absolutely essential. The courage to stop managing other people's perceptions of you. The courage to let the chips fall where they fall, trusting that a life lived with genuine integrity and genuine self-possession will attract what it is supposed to attract and repel what it is supposed to repel. Consider what it actually means to stop managing perceptions. Most people are running, at almost every moment of their social lives, a background program whose sole function is to calculate how they are being received. Am I coming across as too eager? Am I being interesting enough? Did that comment land the way I intended? Does this person still like me after what I just said? That program runs so constantly, so automatically, that people mistake it for consciousness itself, mistake the anxious monitoring of external approval for genuine self-awareness. But they are opposite things. Genuine self-awareness is directed inward. It is the capacity to observe your own thoughts, feelings, and motivations with honesty and without excessive judgment. The approval monitoring program is directed entirely outward, and it is extraordinarily expensive. It consumes enormous amounts of cognitive and emotional energy that could otherwise be directed toward actually living your life, toward building the things that matter, toward developing the skills and the relationships and the inner resources that constitute a genuinely rich human existence. When you shut that program down, not partially, not strategically, but genuinely, because you have made a real decision that other people's moment-to-moment perception of you is not the organizing principle of your life, you reclaim an astonishing amount of energy. And that energy, redirected toward your actual life, begins to produce results that are visible. Not because you are trying to produce visible results, but because a person operating at full capacity, without the constant drain of approval seeking, is genuinely more creative, more decisive, more present, more compelling in conversation, more effective in their work, more comfortable in silence, and more capable of genuine intimacy than a person who is running half their cognitive bandwidth on the question of how they appear. The avoidant notices this. They notice it before they understand it. It shows up as a feeling rather than a thought, a slight but unmistakable shift in how it feels to be near you, to read your messages, to hear your name mentioned in conversation. Something that was once familiar and therefore psychologically manageable has become unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar, for a person whose attachment system is organized around control, is deeply compelling in a way that the familiar never quite manages to be. The familiar can be kept at the right distance. The familiar can be categorized, filed, managed. The unfamiliar demands attention. The unfamiliar pulls the gaze back again and again because the avoidant mind, like all human minds, cannot rest comfortably with an unresolved question. And you have become an unresolved question. There is a concept in psychology called the Zeigarnik effect, the well-documented tendency of the human mind to dwell on incomplete tasks and unresolved situations far more persistently than on completed ones. The avoidant who left you, who filed you under resolved, who moved away with the unconscious confidence that the chapter was closed, that person is now experiencing something that violates their filing system. The chapter they thought was closed has reopened, not because you did anything dramatic, not because you reached out or made a grand gesture, but because the person they thought they had resolved is no longer the person that exists. And unresolved things in the human psyche do not stay quiet. They resurface. They intrude on other thoughts. They appear in dreams and in sudden flashes of memory, and in the particular quality of restlessness that descends without apparent cause on an otherwise ordinary evening. That restlessness is the avoidant beginning to reckon with something they have been avoiding, which is, appropriately, the full weight of what they walked away from. Because avoidants are not, despite appearances, people who feel nothing. They are people who feel enormously and have constructed elaborate systems for not acting on what they feel. The distance is not emptiness, it is containment. And containment, under sufficient pressure, the pressure of genuine change in someone they thought they knew, eventually fails. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, incremental ways that begin to add up. A longer pause before they respond to news about you, a question asked through a mutual friend that they could have simply not asked, a like on something you posted after months of silence, a text that reads as casual but required considerable deliberation to send.